good afternoon, and thank you so much for having me as your guest today. I didn't realize all of that was going to be read out loud. I might have made it shorter. I would like to say it will be a wonder today if I make it through my presentation without knocking off my notes, because I don't have the steadiest of hands. But to begin today, I would like to take us all back to the year 2007. Specifically, I'd like to go back to Kansas City, Thanksgiving weekend, and I'd like us to be at Arrowhead Stadium. If any of you are football fans, you may know that this is the weekend that KU and Missouri play their rivalry game, or at least it's when they did play their rivalry game. And that particular year stands out because you may remember, again, that Kansas came into the game undefeated, Missouri only had one loss, and the winner of that game was going to play for the Big 12 title against Oklahoma, maybe even possibly get a BCS bowl bid. Missouri won the game, then lost the Big 12 title, and KU, not Missouri, ended up with that BCS bid to the Orange Bowl, which they won. I actually don't want to talk about the results of the game or remember the glory days, brief as they were, of KU football. I want to talk about the culture surrounding that game. Because this rivalry was billed in 2007 and other years surrounding it as the border showdown. And the University of Kansas said, quote, that this rivalry reignited a border war that had lain dormant since the Civil War. And in fact, both mascots, the Jayhawk and the Tiger, also can trace their histories back to the 1860s. This, to me, as a historian, raises pretty important questions, two related questions, actually. The first, how does a civil war that ravages a nation for 4 years and kills 700,000 people become recreation? And related to that, how do violent guerrilla warriors or soldiers in that war become fuzzy mascots? So these questions, I believe, are especially significant when we consider that when the border rivalry was in its heyday, the early 2000s, other mascots at universities were coming under fire, typically because they denigrated Native Americans. Another mascot as well, which some of you may know, we're not really an SEC country. This is University of Mississippi's mascot, Colonel Reb. He was ousted too in 2003 because people decided he brought too many reminders of the Slave South, the Confederacy, to the forefront when he was on the sidelines. So that Colonel Reb, who's connected to the Civil War, is controversial, while the Jayhawk and the Tiger aren't, I think makes for an interesting comparison. Because it allows us to look at the ways that Civil War memory is allowed to be used in American culture. Now, before I go on and describe the history of these three mascots, I think since it's an interdisciplinary conference, I should go ahead and state, historians, when we look at collective memory, we're specifically interested in the way that people pick and choose parts of the past that they find useful for their present identities. So in the case of these three universities, what they've done is they've picked and chosen different pieces of the Civil War that they liked, and they've put those pieces of the Civil War together and they use them to create a culture and identities for their athletic programs in the 20th and 21st centuries. By comparing these mascots, I argue, we find out basically that most Americans are increasingly uncomfortable with a past that's connected to racism and white supremacy, but most of us are absolutely comfortable with a modern identity that's forged from violence. So what I'll do this afternoon, really briefly, we'll look first at the Jayhawk, its history, and how it became a mascot, then look at the Missouri Tiger, then look a little more at the border war, and then finally look at Colonel Reb and see what conclusions we can draw from that. So let's start with KU. Some of you may remember this from your history classes, I'm not sure, but the Jayhawk, the origins of that word come in the 1850s. And what was going on in the 1850s is that the United States was mired in this controversy over whether slavery was going to be allowed to expand into the territories. And Kansas in the 1850s was a territory, and it got caught in the middle because people from Missouri, which was a slave state, they wanted Kansas to come into the Union as another slave state. People who were living in Kansas and abolitionists from the North and Midwest, they wanted Kansas to join as a free state. So both sides rushed to the state and tried to basically stuff the ballot boxes to get their way politically, but the crisis spilled out onto the border. And people who lived right here along the Missouri-Kansas border began fighting each other, and in some cases murdering each other rather brutally. Kansas became a state in 1861. It was a free state. But the violence on the border didn't stop. It continued throughout the Civil War, and it was not like the rest of the war. So there weren't clear battlefields. We don't have a Gettysburg here in Kansas. What happened in the Kansas-Missouri border war was that guerrilla warriors attacked each other, neighbors attacked each other, civilians, children, women weren't safe from night raids. This was complete chaos. And Jayhawk, that's the name that the Kansas guerrilla soldiers used. Missourians used the name bushwhacker. So a Jayhawk is basically an outlaw. So the war ends in 1865. By the 1880s, the University of Kansas has adopted the Jayhawk as its nickname. And in order to do this, what the university had to do is it had to spend the entire 20th century making excuses for the origins of the word Jayhawk and then explaining why it was okay to go ahead and use that nickname. And one of the first printed accounts of this comes in 1926. A president at the University of Kansas says, well, I mean, first, yes, the Jayhawk was associated with outlaws and crime, but this bird was also courageous and daring, and everything that the bird did was required to, quote, make and keep Kansas free. In other words, everything that the bird did was fine, or the people, because it made Kansas a free state, not a slave state. And in 1944, a university historian builds on this additionally, saying basically, well, I mean, first the bird stood for abolition, and now it just means that a person is a Kansan. Everybody's proud to be a Jayhawk if they're from Kansas. This is still what the university's athletic website says in the 21st century. It says the bird was first associated with, quote, general lawlessness, I'm quoting, but then it came to embody courage and camaraderie, and now everyone from Kansas is proud to be a Jayhawk. And at the same time that the university was basically creating this history for its mascot, it was also distancing the mascot from the war by portraying it as a cartoon. So you can see basically the evolution of the Jayhawk up here. I'm not going to go into each of these. But notice that he first gets boots, supposedly to kick Missouri Tigers, in 1912. And by 1946, we have essentially the mascot that they still use today. They flipped it from time to time. This is known as the Happy Jayhawk. Specifically, that's its name. And one student has said that he's friendly and by no means intimidating. So we have gone from a guerrilla ruffian burning people's houses to a not very intimidating mascot. So it's pretty safe to say that the university has shaped our memory successfully. Missouri, to an extent, has done the same thing with the tiger. The tiger's less infamous, certainly, but the tiger also owes its origins to the Civil War. If you're from Missouri, again, you may know that Missouri itself was divided during the conflict, and the town of Columbia specifically was divided. So people who lived in Columbia sided with the Confederacy, but they didn't like guerrillas. They were vulnerable to attack from guerrilla, and they were constantly worried about it. They also didn't like that Union soldiers had occupied their town and were destroying their college campus. But by 1864, basically, you have this strange alliance between the people of Columbia and the federal soldiers. Columbians formed a home guard unit made in part of students. They called that home guard unit the Columbia Tigers. And this home guard unit worked with the Union soldiers to protect the town's inhabitants from guerrillas. So in 1890, when Missouri adopted the tiger as its mascot, it was paying homage to its student soldiers during the Civil War. And that doesn't mean that they liked Union soldiers. They would still be mad about that for decades. The tiger, Missouri explains, is a perfect mascot because it's brave and comic and ferocious all at the same time. But what's interesting at Missouri is despite the fact that they don't hide the Civil War origins, they've also broadened their mascot's identity to encompass more of Missouri's history. Does anybody know the mascot's name now? Truman. And who's he named after? Yes, President Truman, who's from Missouri. So they've connected him to another part of Missouri's past with its name. When he got the name Truman in 1984, they also gave him a facelift, and the quotation was that he became more kid-friendly. Apparently, he scared kids before 1984. So they made him more friendly, connected him more broadly to Missouri's history. It's a much softer image. So what the universities did, basically, is they softened their mascot, and they made an environment where they could recall the Civil War at will. But it's not so obviously connected that they can't hide it when they don't need to. And they've called the Civil War back to the present in some ways, just in the 21st century, with its border showdown. I don't mean that the rivalry between KU and Mizzou didn't exist before the 21st century. They began playing in the 1890s. They played until 2012. It was a fairly strong rivalry. But if you look through the printed record in the 20th century, you don't really see a lot of references to the Civil War. There's one reference in 1925 to Lawrence being destroyed by a Missouri guerrilla fighter, William Quantrill. But other than that, they just don't talk about the war very much, at least not in print. It's not until after the year 2000 that this border war, this Civil War memory starts bubbling to the surface. Probably has something to do with the fact that the football teams were relatively successful, so the university needed some way to market the game. Mark Mangino, the Kansas coach, used to talk about the Civil War, but more importantly, the fans started recalling the Civil War in their fan culture. They would wear t-shirts depicting John Brown and William Quantrill. These are guerrilla soldiers, again, and they would wear them around at their tailgates. KU students as well really outdid themselves. This is in Allen Fieldhouse in 2009. They've brought Tragic Prelude with them, depicting John Brown, but notice they've changed it to show their national championship trophy, just to rub it in Missouri's face. One Mizzou fan during this time, I think it was 2007, maybe 2008, he says, well, you know, I'm going to protest Kansas. I think they should change their mascot because the Jayhawk committed wartime atrocities. Not surprisingly, KU was not really concerned with this Mizzou fan's point. But what's interesting about it is they don't completely ignore it. And a KU historian says, well, you know, I mean, maybe the Jayhawk did terrible things, but, quote, it's hard to find sympathy with the Missouri side because it was a slave state. In other words, we were for freedom and abolition. Missourians had it coming. Now, before I make connections or conclusions about the Jayhawk and the Tiger, I think we should take another look at Colonel Reb. The University of Mississippi adopted its rebel nickname in 1936. And there is no question they were trying to honor Confederate soldiers. And in the 40s, 50s, 60s, even beyond, the culture at Mississippi just steeped itself in Confederate memory. They had Old South balls. They brought Confederate flags to their football games. The band played Dixie as one of the fight songs. Even the band's uniforms were emblazoned with the Southern Cross, or the Confederate flag that you see behind me. This is how Colonel Reb came into being, their mascot. First, he was a Confederate soldier. He would run out on the field with a football team. But then he became this guy, this elderly plantation gentleman. Most all plantation owners own slaves, so he is by extension a slave owner, and he sort of existed within this Confederate memory. By the 1990s, university administrators were really tired of Confederate flags and Confederate memory. In 1997, they ousted Confederate flags. They banned them from football games. In 2003, they sidelined Colonel Reb. They said he's not representative of a modern university. They pretended like it was because he was an old man, but I mean, we know better. Some of the students applauded this decision. They said, great, we're finally going to move into the present. We're going to be able to attract more students. People in the rest of the United States will take us seriously. We will finally move past the scars of the civil rights movement, the James Meredith controversy, all of that problematic past. The other half of the student body said that their heritage was under attack, their Southern traditions were under attack, that there was absolutely nothing racist or white supremacist about anything having to do with the Confederacy, and especially not Colonel Reb. And what happened is that it wasn't until 2010 that Mississippi was able to replace its mascot. And they replaced it with this guy, the rebel black bear. And what's interesting about the bear is that as soon as he's adopted, the students at Mississippi tried to connect him to the state's history. And one attempt stands out because a student wrote a letter to the editor in which she explained that during the Civil War, some university students actually halted a Union advance in the state with the help of 3 black bears. Then they formed a little unit. That unit became known as the Mississippi Rebel Bears, and they went on to fight during the Civil War bravely and honorably. There's nothing at all true about that. Like, it's completely made up. That doesn't matter, right? The point is that the students figured out a way to celebrate their history, to honor their Confederate soldiers, and adopt a mascot that's sort of connected to the Civil War, but he's definitely not connected to slavery or white supremacy. So if we put the rebel bear together with the Jayhawk and the Tiger, what we find is that we have the answer to how the Civil War can be remembered acceptably. So unlike Colonel Reb, who really can't be divorced from the plantation South and from slavery, these animals are a lot more malleable, right? You can forget about guerrilla violence if you want while you're watching a KU Mizzou game. You don't have to connect the black bear to Mississippi's history unless you want to. And anytime that you do, you're just honoring soldiers who fought bravely. There's nothing wrong with that, seemingly. So what these mascots show us, and I'll just reiterate this from the beginning again, is that while most American sports fans have become profoundly uncomfortable with racist symbols in the last 15 or 20 years, most of us are perfectly comfortable with using the violence of the past to create our modern identities. And I would add in closing that it's especially helpful when the universities carefully market and package the violence of the past so that you only are limitedly exposed. And ideally, you should connect the violence to the abolition of slavery. Thank you.